lot of friendly names in the list of participants. We'll not do it one by one, but we'll recognize yourself and all right. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research and on behalf of the TVD Center for Political Data, welcome to this new edition of the CPR-TCPD Dialogue in Indian Politics. So we all know that we are at the eve of a new election season, which CPR and TCPD will cover. But this should not distract us from addressing larger, actually more important questions that have found new expressions, at least over the past 6 months, in the form of one of the most significant and largest farmers' protest movements India has seen in years. So all of us, I hope, are familiar with the legislations, the bills that have triggered that movement for more than 6 months. Now farmers have been protesting, raising a number of truly fundamental questions about the role of the state in agriculture, about the fate of agrarian communities, about the state of agriculture in the first place, and the limits of the agrarian economic diversification model that has been pursued by successive governments over the past decade. And this moment is important not only for what it does to the politics of the day, but also because this is one of these moments where everything sort of clashed together. I mean, both figuratively and literally as well. The state, the markets, the fate of agrarian communities in all their social and economic diversity. These protests have also erupted from regions that have a rich past of farmers' mobilization, particularly, tracing back to the days of the Green Revolution, the rise of Kisan politics, the rise of figures like Chaudhry Charan Singh, Mahendra Singh Tikait, the mobilization of the 1980s, including, of course, the 1988 Vote Club protest in Delhi, were, constantly reminded. We are constantly reminded of them, through the protests that exist that have taken place today. And those protests in the 80s were really part of a movement of economic and political assertion of specific segments of the peasantry who made claims for a more adequate share of resources and power, who were on a phase of ascendancy and used their power and growing influence and resources to mobilize and make claims. And although a lot of parallels are made between that history and today, there's a lot of reasons to think that the situation today is actually quite different. Today, we may be at the end of a cycle where the communities that once rose through the transformation of the agrarian economy and through state intervention in the agrarian economy are precisely those who suffer from its more recent convulsions. And so in order to make sense of the present, we need to turn to the past. We need to understand the larger economic, political, sociological context in which the current movement is taking place, to understand also what is at stake. And to do that, we have gathered 3 experts who all have spent a great deal of time not only thinking about those questions, but also spent considerable amount of time on the ground observing those transformations from close. Mekhala Krishnamurthy is an associate professor of sociology, dear friend and colleague, senior fellow at CPR. Harish Damodaran is rural affairs and agriculture editor at the Indian Express. And Surinder Jhodka is a professor of sociology at GNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. In the media, they've published extensively, and all of them actually produce extremely accessible research content and or reportage on those questions. I really encourage you, if you're not familiar with their work, to go online and look at their writings over time. But Mekhala, I would like to start with you and ask you very simply, to give us an overview of the transformation of agriculture policy in India, right? And give us an idea of the evolution of the role of both the state and markets, and on what both the state and markets mean in the imaginary of agrarian communities, at least in northern India. So what are the underlying tensions that exist, in the agrarian economy? What do farmers think about both the state and markets as space also of contestation? What have been the tension that emerged from the way agriculture policy have evolved over time? In other words, what's been going on over the past 50 years? So you have about 12-15 minutes to cover that, after which we will delve in greater detail into the case of UP and the case of Haryana and Punjab. Thank you very much, the three of you, for participating in this. Thank you to the audience. And Mekhala, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Gilles. It's a great privilege to be here among all of you, and I will provide a sort of an overview, as you suggested, to set up the conversation. But I'm really very much looking forward to hearing both Harish, Damodaran, and Surinder, Jhodka, from whom I learn a lot, all the time. So I'll try and be fairly quick in my sweep of this topic that you've asked. So, I mean, just to make a few points, and we are in now several months into what has been a period of, incredible mobilization, a lot of commentary as well. And I'm sure many of you here are not only very familiar with the laws that have created this crisis, have been following the debate closely. So I want to just, make a few reflections. The first is, even the context in which we gather today, which is this. These laws are now called the farm laws. Now, I mean, I think Harish or Surinder might correct me, but it's the first time I've actually heard agricultural market laws being called farm laws, which is itself a source of some interest. Everybody talks about farm laws as if this is about farm policy or about agricultural farming policy, which would have actually been, for the longest period of time, production centered. Right, so it's to me quite interesting that a set of 3 laws that are really about agricultural markets have been called farm laws. Now, I mean, it's incredibly important because these have been placed at the heart of thinking about agricultural policy and agricultural reform as a whole. Whereas I think all of us, know that for the largest period of time, whether it was thinking about land reforms, whether it was actually considering production conditions, those were the core elements of agricultural policy. I mean, even the Green Revolution was very much focused on thinking about agricultural production and on the need to increase agricultural production. So most of the time when we think about farm policies, we think about production systems. And we move from production systems into thinking about markets. But this is a moment in Indian, policy history where over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a, focus on agricultural incomes brought around by this announcement about doubling farmers' incomes, in which the role of the market as the key to resolving this problem of low incomes has been highlighted. So, it is actually quite interesting, but also surprising that, these policies have now come to stand for agricultural policies as a whole. And I would say that this is quite an important shift in thinking about agriculture, where you would usually begin from production, then move to markets. And in fact, it's actually been production and consumption, food security and agricultural production conditions that have dominated agricultural policy. And when we go to the Green Revolution, we will see precisely exactly how that happens, because it was in the context of food shortages that we were really pushing agricultural production as well, and the context of food insecurity. So I want to put that point out. The second point I want to make is that although agricultural production has been what has been at the heart, and land and produce and production markets have been what we've talked about, agricultural markets, of course, have an old history. And this is because Indian agriculture, across its very, very varied conditions, has experienced very uneven but quite extensive commercialization over a long period of time. Right? And this is pre-colonial, colonial, and of course post-colonial. And these are long and complex and regional specific processes of commercialization. And commercialization of Indian agriculture has existed and coexisted in different parts, with subsistence agriculture, with a wide variety of different kinds of production systems, and certain crops and certain commodities have actually been differentially commodified at different points in time. And so we have this long and uneven history of commercialization in which agricultural marketing policy has also played a critical role. Now, the agricultural markets themselves, and these laws are really agricultural market laws. They are central laws on the governance and regulation of Indian agricultural markets, have an interesting history, and a number of people have pointed this out already, that they sort of begin with a colonial history, in terms of policy, in the 1928 Royal Commission on Agriculture, and the idea of where did the origin of the species of the mandi come from, right? Again, it's interesting to keep in mind that these terms, mandi, hart, ganj, again, have an old history across multiple different complex field sites, and that these are old forms. We had mandis before we had APMC mandis, right? We had harts before we had the Gram scheme that now recognizes them as Grameen rural agricultural markets. These are, dense and complex nodes of interconnection across rural India, and that have always and historically connected the rural and urban, particularly the small towns, right? So again, we have this old history. But their regulation became particularly salient during, the early 20th century, and then in post-independence India. And here it's really important because the roots of agricultural marketing policy in India has to do with this idea that India has a very large number of very small farmers, and the importance of properly regulated market sites, publicly regulated market sites, which we now call mandis, where you would actually have farmers taking their produce, and you would have market yards that are governed by local committees, right? That would actually look at this. So the context again here is that over 50 years, we've had very, very uneven implementation of these laws. And of course, very importantly, both through pre-colonial and colonial and then post-colonial times, these have been state subjects. Right? So we have always historically thought of agricultural marketing as part of agriculture, the first transaction, primary markets as belonging to the domain of agriculture. And therefore, there was never a single policy in India to govern all agricultural markets. Right? So this is the second very important point. First, that agricultural markets don't stand in for all agricultural policies. Second, that agricultural markets themselves were part of long histories of commercialization. Third, that these have always been provincial or state subjects in the context of independent India. And in that context, they represent a very particular kind of understanding about the role of the state in governing the market. The understanding there is that you have a natural tendency towards monopolies because you have a very large number of small sellers, in any given region, a small number of buyers, and that these buyers needed to be located in particular sites where the government could, through oversight of local market committees, ensure that basic standards existed, right? So this was standards of price discovery, which meant that you would have auctions. These are, standardization of weights and measurement, the recording of all transactions, ensuring that payments are settled on time, and on-site dispute resolution, right? So this is the context. Of course, like with everything in India, when they were implemented over the years, there has been unbelievably uneven implementation. So depending on where you go in India, you will find very dynamic, strong mandi committees in some states, You will find other states where you have very few mandis in existence on the ground. In other states where mandis exist on paper but don't exist in practice. In other states where yards exist in practice but the real market is elsewhere. And all of this has happened, right? So I think what is notable about this movement is that, and I've been studying mandis now for the last 12 years, it is very interesting to see farmers defend mandis. Mostly, whenever I would do my field work in Madhya Pradesh, farmers would tell you, ये मंडी में कोई satisfaction survey करने नहीं आता है, right? It is a site of contestation. It is always a site where farmers are vulnerable to all kinds of malpractices by traders. It is a site where they know that they may not get a fair price. And so it's very interesting today that, farmers are defending APMC mandis, right? And I think this is really interesting because historically, at least where I've seen it, usually when government tries to reform mandis, it's traders who resist, right? In 2002, 3, 4, when ITC was brought in and it was allowed to operate outside the mandi and given licenses to operate by the state government in Madhya Pradesh, it is the traders who went on strike for over a month, right? It wasn't farmers. And so it's very interesting to me when people say that farmers have come out today because they have been organized by artyas or they've been organized by traders. Because quite to the contrary, what is remarkable about this moment is how much farmers, and not only in Punjab and Haryana, but in Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka, have understood the value of a changing policy, which goes from incomplete and poor public regulation and lack of sufficient investment in markets to actually deregulation and the withdrawal of markets. So today, what you're seeing is farmers fighting for a range of things. And if you actually spend time in the field, you will see both farmers and traders fight in mandis all the time. It's just you don't see it centrally because we previously never had a central law. So the fact that they have landed up in Delhi is because now we have a single law for the whole country, which has not really happened before. These contestations used to be state specific. We today see them in Delhi. But I think what is even more notable is the heightened appreciation. And we need to understand that when farmers defend mandis and MSP, we need to ask what is going on here. And what is going on is, I think, a very clear understanding that there's a difference between promises that have been deferred, systems that were supposed to be built but were never adequately built, and promises that are now likely, in their mind, to be denied, right? That the system actually shifts from one where the government takes up regulatory control of markets and then actually thinks that markets need to be properly regulated in favor of farmers, to assuming that deregulation allows for competition and allows the market to enter. So I think this is actually very notable, that for the first time, at least in many years that I've studied it, and this is why when people say that many farmers across India have actually wanted these changes historically, they have wanted more competition. I don't think they have wanted deregulation, right? They have wanted better regulated markets. They have wanted more mandis. They have wanted more transparent context. And when I say mandis here, I mean better regulated markets, right? And what I think we are picking up today is the profound sense that there's a shift in the terms of engagement itself that the state is relating with the market. And we know historically that deregulation in contexts of asymmetry do not favor the smaller actors. They favor those with market power. And so I think it's actually a very astute reading. These laws are not just bad process in terms of not having adequately consulted the states or done parliamentary procedure right, etc. They're actually a fundamental change in the way in which the state thinks of its regulatory function. So I'll hand over, with just one last point, that this is what the laws seem to be doing. And I'm happy to discuss in Q&A why people feel that the existing mandi system will be compromised by these particular set of laws, but they are dramatically deregulatory in their action. I want to make just two smaller points, that I think the protests are also about what the laws don't do. right? And what farmers have been looking for over the last 20 years, but we've seen it in very recent times in 2018 and earlier, is actually for a changing engagement and investment with rural India, right? And with the agrarian context. And what has been passed off as actually something that is going to be transformative is the opening up of markets, right? It is not the flooding in of public investment or new ways of building the agricultural system or reducing risk or mitigating risk, but actually a deregulation, right? And so what they were looking for and have been asking for a long time is much greater public investment and much greater risk mitigation. So as much as what the laws don't do is at stake here, which was, their understanding of what is required for Indian agriculture is not radical deregulation, but much greater investment and a much greater and more responsive role for the state. So, I'll end here with this context, and then we can come back to some of the specifics.
Thank you very much, Mekhala. And I mean, what has been abundantly clear also is that these protests do not merely or just erupt from, a fundamental disagreement about what agricultural policy should look like, but they are also taking place in particular locations and in particular states that have a long history of movement, Kisan politics and organization. And they also take place among segments of farmers who may be, as I mentioned before, at the end of a cycle, in the sense that these are really the categories that rose through the Green Revolution, that asserted themselves politically through organizational politics, through Kisan politics, through their weight behind a variety of, political parties, and always succeeded in sort of, extracting something from the state by virtue of the strength of their mobilization, demographic resource, and so forth. And today we have a picture of protesting farmers that feel, almost dispossessed from, those asserting qualities that, they used to have. And so that is my segue towards Uttar Pradesh and Western UP in particular, which has been one of those, locations with that kind of, history. And I turn to you, Harish, to give us a little bit of clarity of protesting farmers then and now, how different, the situations are, and what sort of keys of understanding do we need to have in order to make sense of those variations as well. And just before you start, we will take questions after, at the end of the three presentations. Please use the Q&A to write down your questions, and we'll make sure that we'll cover all of them, if not all of them, most of them. Harish.
Harish, you're mute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, see, there are two aspects which I wanted to bring in here. The first is what we are seeing today, these protests. These are protests not of poor farmers, okay? They are not either rich farmers, okay? These people like to have pizza, etc. So we are used to not seeing farmers, who have pizza, wear jeans, etc. Right. So to that extent, it hurts us, because we saw an earlier set of protests, which was in the Long March, which were really poor, Adivasi farmers. These are not Adivasi farmers. These are neither rich nor are they poor. Okay. These are, you can call them the middle class farmers, and like any middle class, it is aspirational. Okay, and all middle class, they identify their interests with the national interests, right? I mean, in this case, it is say Bharat. Okay, whereas so there are a lot of parallels you can say between this and the Anna movement. Okay, that was also of the middle class, but that was the urban middle class, and this is basically the rural middle class. Okay, and when I'm saying rural middle class, I mean basically a class which has seen good times in the past, which has experienced some bit of prosperity. Like in the case of Punjab, very clearly it had to do with the Green Revolution, the new wheat varieties and the new paddy varieties, typically, your old wheat varieties before the Green Revolution would have been, the average yield would have been about, say, 1 to 1.2 tons. Okay, and then that goes to about, say, 3.5 to 3.7 tons, with all your Kalyan Sona and Sonalika, etc. And then they continue to grow, I mean, you can say that after 90s, they continue to grow. You had very good new varieties coming in, but basically, your yields get stuck to, say, about, say, 5 to 5.2 tons, in the case of wheat. And in the case of paddy, it is about, say, around, say, 6.5 tons, whereas you would have started off with hardly, maybe 1.4, 1.5 tons. So this is a huge increase when you see it accumulated over a 4-decade period, from say 1 to 1.2 tons to, say, 5 to 5.2 tons in the case of wheat. And in the case of paddy, you're starting off, say, from about 1.5 tons, and you're going all the way to say around something like, say, 6.5 tons. This is a huge increase, so which you see in Punjab and in Haryana, and where the farmers really experience some kind of a rising prosperity. Okay, so that is what you see in Punjab. In UP, I would say that this kind of an increase in prosperity probably happened more from the late 90s to the 2000s, to the first decade of the 2000s. You had many, especially if you look at, for example, the entire sugar belt. You can see, I mean, right from the western UP, your upper Doab, Rohilkhand, the Terai, and actually even Awadh, and going all the way to Kushinagar. Basically your entire northern UP, you can say, the sugarcane belt. If you see most of your, I'll say about half of the capacity which you have today, the crushing capacity, the mills, they would have come up after about 2004. Okay, so that happened with sugarcane. Earlier farmers were, of course, growing sugarcane, but you never had so many sugar mills. And in terms of prices, the prices went up hugely, especially during Mayawati's period. I think when Mayawati started off, it was around, I think, 125 to 130 rupees per quintal, and by the time she ended, it was about 240 to 250 rupees, So you had both, and then after that, you had this new variety called CO0238, which came, which boosted the yields. I mean, I would say that that CO0238 was to sugarcane what Sonalika and Kalyan Sona and HD2285, etc., were to wheat, or IR8 and PR106 was to paddy. So you see that kind of a prosperity coming in because of whatever the new varieties, the prices going up. There was a huge improvement in the terms of trade for agriculture. Maybe from the early 2000s till almost, say, about 2013, 2014, that period. So you had many things coming together. You had the spread of irrigation. You had many things, and in UP you see it not only there, but also if you go to the potato belt, which is which is basically just below the Yamuna. If you look at this you can call it the lower Doab, the middle and lower Doab, right from, say, Mathura, Agra, Firozabad, Hathras, Itawa, Firozabad, and then going right up to, say, Kannauj, and even maybe, parts of Allahabad, Jaunpur, Barabanki. So you in potato, what you see is a lot of cold stores coming up. There were hardly any cold stores, maybe about 50 cold stores across UP till say the early 2000s. And today now you have around, I would say about 1,000 cold stores. In fact, just last week I was traveling the entire stretch from right from Agra, Agra, Firozabad, Kannauj, all around. In fact, this is the right season to go to to that belt because the potato harvesting is happening there. So in short, what I'm saying is that you had a huge improvement in rural incomes because of higher yields, improvement in terms of trade and those kind of things. So we are talking of a roughly 40, maybe 4-decade long period of prosperity. And when I'm saying prosperity, I'm saying that it was benefiting this particular rural middle class. Maybe say 5 acres onwards. 5 acres upwards. So we are not talking of marginal farmers and those kind of people. We are talking of, say, maybe middle farmers, medium to semi-medium, and the other thing again, which is very striking, is these are areas where we are seeing where there is assured irrigation. Whether it is canal, whether it is tube well. So this is a very specific and whatever and a movement of its own kind. It's you cannot. The problem is we try to club in Adivasi movements, everything together in this. This is not. This is very clearly a rural middle class movement. Okay, these are serious farmers. These are full-time farmers. Who owe their their prosperity to agriculture. Okay, and like all middle class, they cannot do things like you cannot expect these farmers to go and do farm labor or even come to the cities and work as, say, security staff or liftmen and that kind of a thing. So basically, what we are seeing is basically a kind of middle class which is now facing an existential threat. And that is what has brought them here. And there is also politics. I mean, I think what I think what the BJP under Narendra Modi has very successfully crafted is an alliance between the upper castes, right? I mean, the urban upper caste, and probably the real niche garib tabka, the new the aspirational poor, Whereas here we are talking of the middle class, So basically the lower. The non-dominant communities, maybe Dalits, and within Dalits probably it will not include maybe the Ravidasis or the Jatavas, etc. So the kind of poor people who are happy with getting an LPG connection and electricity connection, the basic requirements, whereas this middle class we are talking of is not the kind of people who are what is it called? They've got their basics, and they are aspirational, and today they are experiencing a kind of a spiral down, like for example in UP the cane prices haven't been now raised for the last 4 years, and I think ever since this BJP government has come, the prices have gone up by just 10 rupees per quintal. Whereas during Mayawati's time, as I said, they went up from 125 to 240. Which is what, 115 rupees, right? And during Akhilesh's time, I think they went up by another about I think something like 50 rupees. During the Samajwadi period. Whereas during the last 4 years, prices have gone up by just 10 rupees, whereas the costs have gone up. So I think this thing has sort of, it has hit this class very hard, and they are coming and they seem to be coming together. And now I can see 3 kinds of farmers, like all of them are middle class. Okay, they are not poor, they are not rich. Okay, but I can see that there are 3 kinds of farmers in this movement now. The first is basically the Punjab and Haryana farmers, and the APMC and all these things. What Mekhala is talking about, it obviously affects only them, right? Because they are the ones who are selling wheat and paddy to say FCI and the government agencies and all, and they are selling it in the mandis, right? So they have reasons to be, to feel threatened, that ultimately the mandis will shut down and we won't have any place to sell, and the government will exit. So it is some kind of a deregulation. The second set of farmers, I think, is basically in UP, which we are finding it, and they are basically actually selling a crop which has an MSP which is enshrined in law. Okay, sugarcane, in sugarcane, you don't have just minimum support price, but you have a fair and remunerative price which is statutory. It is payable by law. Okay, you are supposed to, the mills are supposed to pay within 14 days. Okay, but the problem there is lack of enforcement, which is happening, and especially under the current government, there's been absolutely no payment or anything, so it's been a double whammy for the sugarcane farmer, because neither has his the price gone up, but even the existing price, there is no payment happening on time. Okay, so these farmers have nothing to do with these laws, with these farm laws, as even Mekhala was talking about. A third set of farmers, I think, are these potato farmers. I interacted with a lot of them, especially in Kannauj. Most of them were mainly from the Kurmi community. Okay, so I asked them, do you think that this movement which is happening, I mean, do you identify with it? The first thing they said, no, these are all rich farmers. They're all from Punjab and all these things. What's it called? They have time to agitate. We cannot afford to go and sit in Ghazipur, like this. So then I asked them that, is there costs? Is it justified? They said that, no, see, look, even we don't sell in mandis. We have nothing to do with these. Our sales happen through, because we put our crop in the cold stores, and the sales happen from the cold stores. So there's no mandi and all these things. But one thing which they identified is with, the idea that there should be a minimum support price. Generally, everybody you talk to, they say that, our cost of production of potato is about, 8 to 9 rupees. So there should be a minimum support price. I think this is something which is one of the legacies of this movement. That the idea of an MSP, the idea of a fair price, that as a farmer, my cost should be covered. You ask any farmer today, I think maybe across India, I think this is one of the legacies of this movement. That I should be entitled to a minimum support price. That there is a certain price, and the government should ensure it. It's the duty of the government to ensure that whatever work I do, I should get a just reward for my work. I think this consciousness I think this consciousness has really probably, I don't know, enhanced in the last maybe 3-4 months, kind of a thing. I think every farmer talks about it, talks about this, whether or not he or she identifies with the movement. Then last, I think, which I found very interesting, especially while I traveled in Western UP, where there are, I mean, the mandis, the system is not as strong, but at the same time, there I think it has to do with the identity, with the Jat identity. I think this movement has created, for the first time, it has created some kind of a unified Jat identity, and it has united the Jats across Punjab, across Western UP, Rajasthan, Haryana, and even Punjab, So, and this distinction between Sikh Jat and Hindu Jat, I think, has disappeared, and there is some kind of an identity, So I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who talked about about Kheda and Bardoli movement, I think he called it as a movement of the Patidar peasant, So I think this movement, apart from being a rural middle class movement, it is also a movement of the Jat. It has reinforced the identity of the Jat. and this chart, it will be, even if you're a Jat, if you're a lawyer in London, or you're a chartered accountant in New Zealand, right? It has created a sort of it has created a unified Jat identity. I think that is going to be another legacy of this present movement which we are seeing, and everybody feels about it. I mean, it's something like it's something like how maybe the Hindu upper caste identify with Article 370 or the Ram Mandir, right? I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of NRIs in the US who won't know where Baramulla and Sopore are, but still they'll say no, Article 370 it should go. It has gone. It is wonderful. Same thing, they won't have any idea where Ayodhya or Faizabad or Lucknow are, but still they identify with it. So I think a similar kind of a thing, identifying with these farm laws. So farm laws is no longer about technicality. Just like we know that Ayodhya was no longer a matter of about archaeology, who built the temple, what was it, what kind of architecture was it, just like people who talk about Article 370. I mean, they won't know about whatever instruments of accession and all those, those kind of things. So now I think it has ceased to be anything to do with the law, the finer details, and I think that is something probably this government has not caught on. You're talking about. So now it has become a matter of sentiment. Like whatever izzat ki baat ho gayi hai. So I think that is what has happened, and so these are the various strands. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I've spoken in a very coherent way, but I think I'll stop for now. Maybe we can discuss something later. Thanks.
Thank you, Harish. And we now shift towards the terrain of Haryana and Punjab. And as I do that, and as I turn to Surinder, I'm reminded of the famous article, the couple of articles published by Paul Brass in 1980 about the politicization of the peasantry. He explained in great detail the process through which the middle peasantry, became more and more mobilized, what were the sources of, these mobilizations, and how they succeeded in, meeting political allies, which in the process were themselves transformed to sort of carry their assertions politically, notably through the figure of Charan Singh, but also other. And the question that I really want to ask you, Surinder, is, beyond the specific case of Haryana and Punjab, what has happened to those asserting communities? I mean, have we seen a moment of depoliticization of, the peasantry, which is sort of, again, turning on its head now? What is at stake also, sociologically, politically, in this particular moment when you put it in perspective with the past? So, Surinder.
Thank you very much, Gilles. I will try to kind of respond to your question, but also the earlier two speakers have kind of said many things that I had in mind, and I think I more or less agree with them. But I would kind of add a footnote to what Harish concluded with. I think all movements are movements. By definition, they are movements. So you can't really characterize them while the movements are actually going on. I think we'll have to wait for 6 months or 1 year to say whether it is a Jat movement or it's a farmers movement or it's something else. I think that's a very important question. I think we should keep that. I would like to foreground that point, that it is an evolving situation. For example, it was a different movement when it started in November. It was different movement in kind of by middle of December. On 26th of January, it became something else. On 28th or 29th of January, it became something else. And I think we don't really know what all will happen in coming days. And I think as we kind of reflect on it after, say, 6 months or 1 year, we will perhaps, or maybe even 5 years, then we would realize actually what did this movement do to kind of rural context or India or to larger democracy. I think that's something which one should kind of, but even then, I think there are some points that I think that the way Harish has very rightly pointed out, the middleness of the middle class and people who have stakes. I'll also underline this point in a slightly different way. I think one way of, I've been thinking about this question earlier when people were working on farmers' movements of 1980s, there was a kind of clear consensus that, the farmers' movement of 1980s were historically very different from the peasant movement of the earlier 20th century. So we were talking about Bardoli and other kind of, Telangana and movement in other parts of the country. Those were movement around question of land. In some sense, they were very political and they were transformative movement. They were asking for freedom. They were in some sense systemic movements. And the movement that emerged in 1980s, all movements have their politics. It's not like they don't have, all movements are about politics. I think politics is what it is, right? And they have all kinds of political effect, but they try to present as a kind of non-political question. So I think in the 1980s, what we saw, the way Sharad Joshi kind of framed it in a very populist language, Bharat versus India, but there were actually questions, there were the movements around the question of price. So you have a different kind of cultivator who comes to the scene, who is not a peasant in the classical sense of the term, who works with his family labor, produces primarily for his own consumption. Some of it is taken away as land revenue. These are people who are entrepreneurial cultivators. And I think this is a different kind of commodity that we are talking about, the farmers of 1980s. And their concern is primarily price of input and price of output, and how we benefit. In that sense, the emergence of a new kind of entrepreneurial middle-class farmer, and they are the ones who started protesting in 1980s, which was very different from the earlier process. I'm increasingly beginning to think that this is, I think Mekhala already pointed towards this, that this is a third moment of agrarian movements. And this movement is not simply about price. It is not simply about land. It is a transformative movement. It's a systemic movement where they're trying to negotiate terms of political and economic policies, that how the state should function. I think these are much bigger political movements which are addressing the state and trying to, at some level, tell the state that we also exist and we have a position and we know what you're doing. And these are not simply about price. These are not simply about questions of negotiation or bargaining. These are, I think, classical, in the Marxist language, one would think in terms of class struggle. So this is a kind of, trying to establish a class balance. Within that, obviously, there are many identities. So that is my first point, that these are kind of should be seen as the third moment of agrarian mobilizations, which are focusing primarily on question of mandis and markets, but they're also raising very fundamental systemic questions, which in some sense talk about how the state policy should be. For example, the kind of politicization that has happened on ground in Punjab, even a kind of, villager women would tell you that these are, corporate interests. I mean, these are things that when we were students, comrades used to talk about, and they use exactly the same kind of left-wing language without actually being leftist at all. So there's a new kind of politicization which has kind of happened. Second point that I wish to make, if we want a kind of question that Gilles was asking me, and I think the point that has already been made, that we need to recognize that agriculture is not like anything else. That's why it is a state subject. I think agriculture needs to be seen in its regional context, and I think that is very important. The regional context of Punjab is very different from regional context of UP, as he was talking about. Within UP, regional context of Eastern UP will be very different from Western UP. And I think they emerged from Punjab, and there is a reason for this. And Punjab, they kind of have their own specific kind of consolidation, which happens before anywhere else. And then, as I said, they evolve. And I think I would see this consolidation as coming together of some kind of agrarianism, that agriculture needs to be protected and agricultural interests need to be pursued, along with some kind of mobilization of Sikh ideology. This is something which was very visible in the beginning, and it continues to be. Mahendra Singh Takayat wears a green Sikh turban. There's a different kind of Jat turban, but this is a Sikh turban that he wears and goes around. And I think that symbolism is very, very critical. And this again will take us time to understand. The third, it brings together what Harish was talking about, some kind of Jatism. I think there is a kind of core identity is that of Jat cultivator or Jat cultivator, but then it is again evolving. That itself is undergoing change. If you look at the language of somebody like the singer, what is his name, the famous singers, the Grewal, you would kind of decode that, the way it has changed from a kind of very Jat-centric to a more kind of people-centric ideology. And then how within Punjab, for example, Ugraha and Rajyewal come together. This is coming together of the left wing of farmers movement with the more center and right wing of farmers movement. So there are many things coming together where that's why it becomes a systemic kind of movement again, where left parties, left organizations. In Punjab itself, there are 32 of them, and initially all of them were together. Now there are, I think, 2 of them have been expelled, but rest 30 are still there. And what is specific about Punjab? I think that is another very important point that we should recognize. I think, again, the point that Harish and Mekhala were making in some different ways. Punjab is a state where agriculture still matters. So they are full-time farmers. They are, say, for example, in Bihar, if you go, people would have an acre of land, 1 acre of land, 1/4 of acre of land, and that is also not irrigated. You have to depend on nature. So you have land, you would be proud Bhumihar, but you don't have any Bhumi, right? You work as security guard in Delhi, and you do all kinds of odd things just to kind of, but agriculture continues, which your women at home and old man will be cultivating. You don't give up on that, but at the same time you need to diversify and you go to the city and buy. So these are serious farmers, and Punjab is a place where agriculture is most valued, both culturally but also economically. And I was looking at numbers recently. Annual income of Punjab farmer is still something like 23,000 rupees, and it is the highest in the country, right? Second is Haryana, which is around 18,000 rupees. Third is Kerala, which is around 15,000 rupees. So agriculture is a serious business in Punjab even now. And interestingly, I mean, number of people who actually do agriculture in Punjab is much lesser than what we think of. It's not 40% or 50%. It's only around something like 26%. That is 26% of the total kind of adults 50 years and above would say that this is lots of people have moved out of agriculture. So I think there is something very specific about Punjab, and that I think we need to understand, where agriculture is done as a serious business. And therefore, I think what Harish was earlier talking about, people who have stakes in agriculture, who want to pursue agriculture, and that's why they perhaps, and then along with them, Haryanvis come in, and within that, obviously, Jats are the ones who are likely to have land. But again, it has resonance across castes and across communities. I would not say at this moment that it is a Jat movement or Jat movement. I think it's a larger movement, and it is spreading. Other kind of categories of farmers, Artiyas, and everyone is joining, as we were informally discussing how in Punjab, urban traders have voted this time against BJP for political reasons. The third point, fourth point that I want to make, and then I will kind of wind up, is one more point actually, is the question of I think caste and internal kind of differences to some extent, which I've already made. That is something which is a very interesting kind of process, where in case of Punjab, for example, they very creatively invoke the language of Sikhi, which is acceptable even to the left as well as to the right. If you go to any of these morchas, Ugraha is sitting on the eastern border, western border, and the Akalis type of Sikhs are sitting on the northern border. And I think these are kind of political differences, but on the question of Sikhi, all of them in some sense invoke that, and that at some level brings them together. And there are kind of interesting caste dimensions within it, which we need to see how at some level this also is a moment when these contests have become less significant. Like in case of Punjab, again, I can say perhaps also Haryana, that the Jat and urban Khatri conflict has come down, because many of the Jat Sikhs have themselves become traders, themselves become commission agents in mandis. And the conflict between Dalit and Jat has also declined, because Dalits no longer work on farm as landless laborers, and that in some level brings them together, and there is kind of moral support. There has been no opposition to farmers movement in Punjab, for example, from any side from Dalits. My final point is how do we need to at some level think about farmers politics today, or farmers movement today, beyond simply language of economics. And this is something which is very, very critical, because they are trying to at some level invoke a very different idea of politics. And I think that is something which would perhaps be left with us later on. And we need to, at some level, give that space to this movement to articulate that agenda. And I think that's something which is still taking shape. If you read them, if you listen to the music that is coming out from these movements, and I think that is huge. So one should not look at it purely in terms of agrarian interests versus urban interests, or corporate interests versus agrarian interest. It is there, but there is something much more that is happening there in the cultural sphere, and that is something which again is perhaps being first articulated in Punjab through Punjabi music. And there's a huge amount of music that has come up, and this is something which we are not really talking about. How should one think about that music? Is it just simply a Jat music? That's how it appears to be. But I think it's much more than that. And I think that is where I think we need to connect the legacy of this movement. If you will think about it for 5 years from now, if you look at, say, for example, somebody like Ugrahan will talk about how we have already achieved so much. There's not even a single person that they have caught on protest site who is consuming say drugs from Punjab, right? So all that question has gone away. So there is a kind of larger politics, or whatever you like to call it, which is kind of being played out in this moment, which we need to take seriously, and don't try to look at it from purely a kind of economic angle and then try to reduce them into a question of price versus question of laws. And yes, there are kind of corporate interests, but there is, I think, much more happening, which perhaps we can discuss a little bit later.
All right. Thank you, Surinder. And members of the audience have started putting questions in the Q&A box. I think all of you panelists have access to them. But let me sort of kickstart the conversation by, in both the case of Punjab, Haryana, and perhaps more so in UP. I mean, when do you trace the origin of this sort of turning of the situations where farmers, backed by a strong sense of identity, a strong capacity to mobilize, have the ability to build political alliance, are courted actually by political parties, and that's something that seems to have sort of turned. I mean, I have done field work across Western UP, and I've been doing so for quite some time. And I've actually encountered, protest movement organized by Mr. Rakesh Tikait. And I have to say they were not particularly impressive, right? Because he's actually been through, the desert for quite some times. So what are, the elements that sort of precipitated that? I don't know if you can talk about depoliticization, but a turn in the ability to actually mobilize around those issues, because there have been controversies around price. There have been complaints about delays in payment. I mean, this has been constant, right? But what is particular also about this moment that creates this resurgence? Maybe Harish, you want to? Let me unmute you.
I think it must have started probably with Haryana, with the Punjabi Khatri chief minister, and the Jats feeling left out for a long time, and probably I think maybe the economic roots started from Punjab, right? I mean, I think the Punjab farmer gave the economic argument, and then probably the others joined in later on, I think Khattar has definitely been one reason. If you see the Haryana elections, the JJP, won a lot of seats, and it was and it was all mostly the Jat vote, and it was actually an anti-BJP vote, and the Jats got quite angry at the fact that the JJP then tied up with the BJP. So I think the Punjab farmers sort of, they pegged away, because Punjab has I think you yourself made a point. They have a very organized peasant movement, right? I mean, you have the unions there, they're very systematic, they have whatever they do, they keep minutes and all these things. These kind of things, Tikayat and all cannot, they're incapable of doing it, So I think the left has been left has a very strong movement, very long presence, In fact, today probably AIKS is more powerful than CITU, So yeah, so probably I think the Punjab, the basic organizational kind of a thing was provided by the Punjab farmers, They latched on to this whole thing that, hey man, this could be the start of MSP going out, and the mandis and all these things. And I think the Haryanvis, they joined, so which is why I still believe that, this is a movement of the Jat peasantry, like why is it that the farmers, the potato farmers in Kannauj are not willing to? I think because, they are Kurmis, and I still believe that BJP will try and make this sort of, a Jat versus non-Jat thing, which they did very successfully in Haryana, right? I mean, making a Punjabi as a chief minister. I mean, it is something like what maybe Indira Gandhi or whatever, like C.B. Gupta when he became the chief minister, right, of UP, right? I mean, so I think this was definitely building. It was kind of the Jats feeling left out. And same even in Rajasthan and all these things. So I would definitely say that this is a Jat movement. I mean, I'm willing to say it even now. I mean, I don't think we need to wait for 5 years for, saying the same. So in any peasant movement, I think you have both, like definitely Kheda and this thing was about the Patidars, okay, they happen to be farmers, but the Patidar identity, just like, for example, your Maharashtra, it is the Maratha movement, right? I mean, how did NCP win this kind of votes? Basically the Marathas were feeling left out, right? I mean, you cannot ignore this thing, So today now, like in Maharashtra, the Maratha swagger is back. Right. So this must have been a very, in the case in Haryana, I think for the Jats of Sonipat and Jhajjar and Jind and Hisar, this must have been a very, last 4, 5 years must have been real torturous kind of a thing, right? And probably maybe even BJP trying to say that, look, we don't need you. We'll manage with the others, And it would be even worse in Western UP. I don't see too many Gujars or Sainis, etc., being part of this movement, And despite whatever, all these, only in Punjab, as Professor Jhodka is saying, it has become a universal kind of a movement, including the Hindus of Pathankot and of Ludhiana, etc. Like the way the Congress won even in the urban areas. But in Haryana, it is definitely still very much a Jat kind of a thing, and in Western UP even more so. The others are just not there. I mean, it is maybe even if they identify with it, and in fact, I'm very surprised. Like for example, sugarcane. Sugarcane is a real. See, the other one, the mandi thing, is a very. It's a kind of a. It's a kind of a fear. You can say it's an imagined fear. That MSP will go. Like I think there's one question also asked that why do Punjab farmers feel that MSP will go away? Why don't they believe in Narendra Modi kind of thing? Whereas in Western UP, sugarcane is a real thing. Prices have not increased, and you have cane payment areas of something like 12,000 crore. At any given point of time. But still, it is still largely a Jat movement. And most of the people, most of the Jats keep saying that others are not joining us. They want to shoot from our shoulders. That kind of thing is there. So I think this is roughly my take.
Mekhala, you wanted to react?
So, just to take off from where Harish left, but also, there are some really fantastic questions, and, it would be great. I'm sure we'll all try and answer as many of them as we can, but I'm going to try and put some of those together with what Harish was also articulating right now. I think with the MSP question, there are two things, right? One is, of course, we associate MSP with Punjab and Haryana, but I have been studying MSP procurement in Madhya Pradesh and in Odisha more recently, in Madhya Pradesh over the last 10 years. And it's actually very interesting because both Shivraj Singh Chauhan and Raman Singh gained a great deal by actually pushing decentralized procurement. They got known both for PDS reforms. Raman Singh was this Chawalwala Baba, and Shivraj Singh Chauhan definitely capitalized on wheat procurement as a political and a changing dynamic of regional procurement is extremely important. So it's interesting that those were popular because they actually provided something. Right? One of the things you have to understand, the source of anger here is also that these are laws which have declared that farmers now have freedoms that actually in real terms they already enjoyed. Most of them were either selling already outside mandis or could sell legally outside mandis. The laws never prevented them from doing so. And most of these states had already allowed private buyers to come and buy outside formally in any case. So to say that today they are suddenly free, it doesn't go down with any farmer, right? Because they already had those freedoms. What they needed was to change their terms of engagement with those markets. And that is not going to be provided by, just announcing a law, right? So I think farmers do understand the structural constraints that actually mean freedom and transformation. And I think so there are 2-3 points on MSP. So far, farmers are not necessarily upset that MSP has been withdrawn because it hasn't been. In fact, the pandemic has meant that there has been record levels of procurement across most states that actually do procurement. So I think in the immediate context, the state has redoubled its efforts to show that there will be no change in MSP policy. But we must remember that, and there's a question on food security as well, that this debate about MSP and about reducing food grain entitlements is not coming in a vacuum. The suspicion is not coming out of thin air. Commission reports, committee reports have talked, and obviously in the case of Punjab, the one that's most cited is the Shanta Kumar committee report. But these for some years have talked about shifting to, direct cash transfers, rolling down the PDS, giving people cash instead of grain, reducing the amount of procurement. We have too much in sense of surplus stocks. We have to change the subsidy regime. Not to say that major changes do not have to happen in the way in which we allocate subsidies and support to farmers, but farmers are not operating in a vacuum. They are operating in a process where, in a system where over several decades, they have seen the reduction in public investment, arrears, the lack of investment in infrastructure, the lack of investment in production. They have seen extension services collapse. They have seen the actual effects of the movement of the state away from a serious investment in agriculture. In that context, to say that freedoms have been granted today and that these are going to be transformative, whether farmers are at the doorstep of Delhi or not, farmers I have spoken to across this country don't necessarily have a high degree of faith that the state is seriously interested in agriculture. And yet, I think this is a moment, and this is why I really do agree with Professor Jhodka here, that I think farmers are saying that there is a fundamental difference between not believing the state has done enough and thinking that now they are not going to do certain things, right? And not going to provide substantial support and not going to regulate the market, right? Recently, I was also in UP, and this was a part of UP where the Mandi Prangan wall had been built. In 1980, the signboard went up. In 2016, the wall was built and a little plaque was put up, inaugurating it. The Mandi still hasn't come. And what farmers and traders there wanted was a Vyavasthit, a well-appointed Mandi. And they said, now the Mandi will never come, right? So I think there is an understanding of this, and we need to appreciate that. I think the second thing I do want to mention here is that, the question of shared interests. And a lot of the questions are pointing to are there shared interests here? Now, with small and large farmers, I completely agree with both speakers that, in fact, this is often led, and market-led struggles are often led by middle farmers, right? Who are high stakes in farming, who gain a lot from farm income, and who fight in the market, right? For whom the mandi matters. But it's also interesting, the stories of both sugarcane, and we've seen this from the cooperative studies that Babaskar and Atwood have done. There was an alliance between small and large farmers that became possible because of the socio-technical relationship of the cane supply problem and the need to work with the factory. So sometimes there are alliances that happen for economic interests between small and large farmers in certain areas. Secondly, in Madhya Pradesh, what I saw in Harda, the fight for a better mandi was led by Jats and Bishnois. But Dalit and Adivasi farmers said they actually avoid them in the mandi line because they can get jammed, and they let them go in front, and daily struggles between them exist. But they said this mandi got vigilant and got reformed because of them. And as a result of their fight in the market, we all benefited, right? And this is something about the nature of public goods and public markets. Because they fought for mandis, better mandis helped all farmers, right? And this is the difference between a public market and a private market, right? It was not just small number of farmers who could access the mandi. So it's like, the same thing happens with schools, and the same thing happens with health systems. The nurses would always tell us, you want to reform our health system, make sure all the rich people have to come and do deliveries here. Make sure the MLAs have to come and do deliveries here. So the fact that the mandi is a publicly regulated market is important, because even when larger farmers fight for it, there are spillover effects which affect all farmers when you have better appointed mandis and when you have better appointed procurement systems. So the fact that large farmers in Punjab and Haryana fought for MSP means that all farmers in Punjab and Haryana today benefit from MSP, even smaller farmers, right? Whereas if the MSP process is captured by a very small number of people, you don't see these effects. So in terms of shared interests, you have seen it in certain places happen between small and large farmers. You're also seeing, I think, in this moment, a profound shared interest articulated between various actors against corporate interests. And so, a lot of mandi traders used to tell me that hamara to capital kab se demonetize ho raha hai. In the new system of political power and raising of funds, smaller actors, including those who felt very much part of the BJP, had said that their political capital has been demonetized well before their financial capital was actually demonetized in 2016 for a period of time. And I think there is a new articulation, and it was very interesting to listen to Gujar leaders from Gujar businessmen in NCR come out in favor of the farm movement and the farmers, because here you're seeing the articulation of small businesses, MSMEs, what is the actually existing private capital in our markets against a notion of organized monopoly capital that may come in the future. So I think that's another shared interest that's emerging. And I think the imagination of the private sector that these new farm laws bring is of the organized corporate private sector. Our current agricultural markets are overwhelmingly private, but they involve small scale actors. And I think there is a new coalescing of certain kinds of interests between capital and producers also here, which are quite interesting, as opposed to thinking only about corporate. And I think there we need to go back to thinking about regional capital, regional industry, the value of investing in MSMEs, in agri-commercial sectors in certain ways, as part of the overall economy as well, right? We need to remember that these are very, very important livelihood sectors. But I want to make one final point. I think nobody would say the current system is working. So what is happening? The current system has a very large number of actors. And so far, it has kept out, I would say, monopoly capital in the sense of those who have full channel command and channel control. And it has done so precisely because it is small and it has a whole range of different actors. So the interesting question is, can we think about how such a system does not only reproduce and keep lots of people alive, but actually allows for greater accumulation, right? And greater kind of sharing of prosperity. And that is why I think public investment is so important, because that's not going to happen with current levels of investment. And I would like to sort of take on the questions Amita and others have asked. For us to actually have genuine shared interests, we have to then introduce consumers into the story and think about the role that urban consumers play, but also that the vast number of poor Indians who depend on food and nutrition security from the state can also play if we were to reimagine this role. So can we think about actually, beyond the movement itself? And I think it's asking a lot to ask farmers' movements to come up with all of these answers. I think this has to be an expansion of this to all of us who care and work deeply in these economies, in these social systems, and who care about food and nutrition security in India and about economy and livelihood. And agroecology is at the heart of that, to rethink what it means to have shared interests in this economy. And that's why I think you could take it as a starting point at best. And as long as you let it become just about politics and the political movement, we will see very narrow horizons. What we need is to actually create a space where we can actually think about shared collective interests and their negotiations. And there, I think the state has to play a role in shaping markets, not just regulating for market failure. So I think there's a very important role to be played there. I think that's a much, much harder moment. And whether this could be that moment, I think many more people will have to invest serious time and effort in thinking about this. I'm not sure the state itself is going to open up this space. I think some state governments might open up the space. I think there are also other kinds of, possibilities. So if that is to happen, I think it's going to need something else. But that, for me, is the only way in which we're going to solve some of these very, very complex issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Mekhala. I mean, I'm reminded of, a really old debate, on the terms of trade in agriculture. And, what is good for farmers' income is actually bad for consumers, because, if the price of agricultural product paid to farmers are higher, then, those poor consumers particularly, are, either receiving it through, food price inflation and so forth. And also in the context of, sprawling urbanization, you need also to maintain, the price of food, low, and sort of the farmers, become at the receiving end, in that, debate around the terms of trade. And so there's a number of questions actually around that. What are the implications of the transformation of the agrarian economy for landless laborers? What are the implications of these proposed reforms, or that sort of vision of statelessness, or deregulation? What are implications for the large populations of landless laborers? And if you can connect, the agitation around markets and MSPs to the question of food security policy for poor consumers, right? Can you tease those apart? So I don't know which one of you would like to react on this question, or maybe Surinder, if you choose to react on another.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say a few things and then I'll leave. I have to go somewhere. I think I kind of broadly agree with what Harish was talking about. Yes, Jats and Jats have been at the center stage of this movement. But to look at more than 3 months, they've been blocking at least 3 borders. On Tikri, they go up to like 16 kilometers. On Kundli border, again, large area has been blocked. There's not been a single, initially ruling party tried to organize some protests against them, but there have been no protests. And these are not really people who are sitting in these areas and the locality in which they are sitting. They are not Jat localities. These are urban traders, urban shopkeepers. Perhaps some of them are benefiting, but a lot of them are also not benefiting. And there are, I've personally not been able to kind of go there because of the given conditions. But I think one should perhaps, yes, we always go with our sociological lenses that it is a Jat movement, which it is. It's very obvious. You don't really have to spend too much time. But I think movements are also moments of becoming, and they're not just moments of being. And I think that is something which we need to spend some time on. In what direction are they taking us to? And I think that's where perhaps, one needs to kind of think beyond economics. One needs to think movements as movements of becoming. What we start with and what we end with could be extremely very, very different things. And it has been going on for more than 100 days now. When did it start? I think last week of November, December, January, February. It's definitely more than 90 days, more than 3 months have gone by. And there has not been, even though there was kind of attempt to create violence and conflict between the people whose areas are blocked. This is not like just one small village. The whole areas are blocked. If you go to Kundli border, nearly 20 kilometers. If you go to Tikri border, another 16, 17 kilometers, where the areas are completely blocked and the lives. And it's going on. I think there is something that we need to, at some level, leave it to, at some level, time to tell us what is it going to be about. This is something different. This is not something that we have seen. I have never seen a movement like this. And the fact that they are sitting here in the city, and I think one should kind of, also there was a question about Akali Congress in Punjab, youth and older people. Youth are completely alienated from agriculture in Punjab. It is this movement that has brought youth into questions of agriculture and prices and what is it going to be their life. So I think there is something which is, all movements have, any student of social movement will tell you, these are moments of creative changes. And what are those creative changes going to be? We don't really know. Yes, there is a kind of caste angle to it, but I think whatever I know of Haryana, if Thakkar is thinking that he would, or BJP is thinking they would be able to mobilize all the non-Jat parties, non-Jat constituencies, they're completely mistaken. I think Haryana is already on the line of Punjab, where a much larger number of people are kind of beginning to identify with. If that was the case, there would have been conflict on Tikri border and Kundli border already. There has been no conflict between the local people and the farmers, and it is nearly 100 days they've been sitting there. There's absolutely no conflict. Why is it? Why is it that they're taking so much? Their businesses are spoiled. They are, otherwise also there are also problems they face, those who have to come to. So I think there is something that is, I think we should recognize movement as movements, and those are fluid moments of becoming rather than of being. And I think that is the point that we should keep in mind, that we don't really know much about this, the consequences of this. There are some stated objectives about government and assured prices. These things may be one aspect, but there's a larger aspect of agriculture and agrarian crisis of agrarian identities, which I think for the first time in last 30-40 years, they have been talking about it. We have been talking about it. Agriculture has been a kind of site of pity and neglect. And this is the moment when agriculture again foregrounds itself. There is something special happening there, and we need to kind of take note of that. And with that, I think I'll stop and I'll leave because I have to go somewhere.
Thank you, Surinder.
Right.
And yes, but if you look at the protest as a form of, identity assertion, it does take place in a context, and I think I'm repeating myself at this point, where they do so, but without having much political allies or much, support from political parties. So to what extent is this also, kind of a last swan song from a generation that, was raised through, stories of assertion, from the 80s, 70s and 80s and before? To what extent, the reminiscence of the 1980s movement, indicates also the presence of nostalgia for a period where not only farmers could protest, but, they were listened to, as compared to, the current situation.
You're asking me this question?
No, I'm making a general comment. I know you.
I think just to add to this, I think one should not try to reduce a moment like this to something which we are familiar with. I don't think something like this has ever happened before in Indian history. These are movements of rural farmers for the first time happening in Northwest India at this scale. We don't really know their resonance in other parts of India because of pandemic, because of various other things. If pandemic was not there, perhaps mobilization would have been visible in other forms from other parts of India, and we would have thought about them very differently. But even here, they are able to kind of come together in such large number is something that we should see with an open-ended mind and try not to reduce it to economic processes or caste processes or party processes. And I think that is something which we should recognize, that these are moments of becoming rather than just being. And I think that then opens up many questions which perhaps we will have to kind of articulate with a creative mind rather than with a kind of mechanical mind, which the economists kind of tend to deploy. But I think they also need to recognize that this is not simply an economic process. This is not simply a political movement. Look at the kind of music that has come out of it. Look at the kind of solidarities that are coming out of it. And I think these have values of their own. They're not simply caste solidarities. Look at, I mean, if you minutely look at the music and listen to the way people speak to each other, there is something happening on ground when Bada Bhai, Chota Bhai, it could be Jat versus Jat in Haryana, but I think there is a different idiom which is being played out within Haryana and Punjab and perhaps now Western UP, and the jal that came to feed him. I think future historians and sociologists will work on jal that came to feed, to give water to this chap, what was the farmer's leader, Takayat. I think that's a different moment. It was not only Jat and Jats coming, all kinds of people, Muslim water also came, and Dalit water also came. And I think those are moments that need much greater cultural attention. And these are moments which also kind of, are cultural moments. And we should kind of give recognition to that and not look at purely simply from economic angle and from kind of, policy angle. And I think there's much more there. I'll stop here. Others will continue.
Well,
sorry, I have to leave. Yeah.
Thank you, Surinder.
Thank you very much for having me. And sorry that
and to complement that, the public arts and the fact that, these protests also take place in the digital space, which also creates the possibilities for all sorts of creativity. But Mekhala, you wanted to...
Yeah, no, I mean, I could not agree more. And I think we should not reduce these to purely, an economic issue and at all. But at the same time, I think we can ask ourselves, and I mean, a lot of the questions are, gesturing in that direction, right? There's an interest in the politics, and there's an interest in the social and cultural elements here. And it is interesting, there was a question about masculinity. Again, just talking about the coalescing, it is very interesting to see the role of women in this movement, not just in doing seva, but the idea that they drove their tractors in. Now, one of the places that you will never find women selling, except actually in our tribal markets, where you will see women selling in, say, Koraput, and also in vegetable markets. But in grain markets in Punjab and Haryana or in Madhya Pradesh, you don't see women unless they're actually mobilized, groups of producer companies coming in. Whereas when they came out and said, we don't come out onto the streets and we don't fight in the markets, but they're here today, I think that's an important move. So, and at the same time, you're also seeing a lot of the unemployed young youth, sons of farmers coming in. And I think this very much, I think Philip Oldenburg has asked this question about how agrarian households, which are now spatially separated between rural and urban, have also come together to express solidarity here. So you have certainly seen it in this movement. At the same time, I do think there is an opportunity for us to rethink agricultural policy, right? And in this, markets play an important role. But I think all of our research over the last many years have shown that, you don't want to go back to the status quo either. So this idea that if you're against the farm laws, you are defending the current system, either the current system of MSP-based procurement, which is highly cereal-centric and highly regionally concentrated, or that you are defending a system of, maybe a lot of people reproducing themselves, but not accumulating, that there is no fair terms of trade and fair terms of exchange, or that a system that is producing very, very drastic agroecological damage. So I think, and that actually promotes a vision of food security that is very minimal and doesn't think about nutrition security for the vast majority of this country either, right? So this was not a system that was working. What it required was not legal reform. And I think that's part of the limitation is, not only are we reducing it to economic issues, we're reducing it to legal issues. So it's not just that we don't understand economy, we understand even less the limitations of the law. And that these are not legal instruments that bring about these transformations, right? That there's a whole range of both public and private investments. There's a whole range of different kinds of social institutions and economic institutions that are involved. There's a whole reimagination of how you actually allocate interest. And I think, therefore, I believe actually, if you, instead of reducing the whole debate to MSP and a law about MSP, if we start thinking about what would parity mean, right, in the context of food markets? What does it actually mean to have competitive markets? Where is market power actually located? I mean, there's a really good question about, monopoly powers. And, typically in the United States and in other places, these entities have worked through channel command and channel control and having multiple things. They control seeds and inputs and credit and finance and markets and retail, right? Can we have new visions of antitrust institutions that are actually good at picking up this? What would it mean to have a good market intelligence system, which is not just about price information, but actually about understanding food and safety and products and all better? So, these change. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done. There's the possibilities for us to do it. But I think if we reduce those possibilities to why are farmers not doing it, and this movement, which as Surinder rightly says, is emergent, it's dynamic, it's political, it's regional. And this is why I really do think we have to go back to the states. We have to think about, what are the regional possibilities? What are the kinds of systems that we're looking at? And then we need to think about where are the collective interests? What kinds of interstate arrangements are important? How do we negotiate in the context of global agreements and trade agreements? Because agriculture is absolutely part of that too. So, this is a massively complex issue, and to renegotiate it in ways that are more fair, more inclusive, that actually produce surplus sustained diversification instead of distress driven diversification is going to need a lot of creativity. So hopefully it's about also reinvesting in the idea. And there were older debates around Indian agriculture that had the seeds of much more interesting ways of thinking about policy in agriculture as well. And we're going to have to think about some of this afresh. So I would say, both, let's not reduce the movement to an economic or narrow political movement, but also let's not reduce agriculture to a legal problem that needs to either hinge on the repeal or the enactment of a set of laws.
Thank you, Mekhala. And while I could actually sit here and listen, both of you and Surinder would just let talk on this subject for hours, we have to bring these sessions to a wrap. Before I do that, Harish, would you like to give the final word or make a final remark?
I'll stick to what I've been saying. This is a Jat movement. Okay. See, there is no continuum. Okay. You have Jat farmers. Then from there, suddenly you have climate activists. Okay. Or all people who are anti-Modi, right? It's not thick enough in the rural areas. It's definitely not bringing in other peasant communities. I don't see Sainis, I don't see Gujars. So to that extent, it is much more narrower. Unlike during Tikai's, during Mahinder Singh Tikai's time or Charan Singh's time, where they really, where I think they were able to really create a unified peasant identity, led by the Jats. Okay, fine, but you cannot say that Mahinder Singh Tikai's movement was just about Jats. They were also Gujars, they were Yadavs, they were Ahirs, they were Rajputs. Whereas here it is very clearly you can see, maybe 80%, 90%. It is only Jats. Okay, and from there you'll suddenly see Bangalore climate activists, and so there is something which is very surreal about this movement, and people have suddenly no problems with CARPs and all these things, right? I mean, everyone at one time they're saying that CARPs very patriarchal institutions, but whereas now we have no problems with CARPs and this thing. So I think I will stick my neck out in saying that its limitation and strength is that it is a Jat movement, but then it's a universal Jat movement. It is not limited to just Jats of Haryana, but also Jats, across maybe London, Paris, everywhere. I'm myself part of some 3 Jat WhatsApp groups. Okay. So you can see how they are bringing. So all this music and culture and all definitely has more of this thing, and maybe yes, Muslims have joined in. Okay, then there is this thing, but I will say that this is the limitation of this movement, and that is precisely the reason why. I think one question is on why MP farmers are not protesting. Right, there is a problem of identifying. Definitely, it's not as though the MP farmer is not does not, but that that message is definitely there. That all farmers should get an MSP, whatever we are producing, and that's another, I think, the real permanent legacy of this movement. But otherwise, it is largely this thing, just like what you had. This is no different from what you had Hardik Patel in Gujarat, or the Maratha, the Mukh, the silent rallies which you had. It is definitely about an identity assertion. Though I'm more an economist and less of a sociologist, but I would say I would say that I would think more political and sociological than pure economic. So that is my that's my closing comment.
Amita Baviska reminded that there are Muslim judges also. Mekhala.
Yeah. But yeah.
No, but I think just to point out that, and there are lots of questions about not just MP, and I do want to say that there have been protests in MP. Mandis actually protested. There were, the Mandi staff protested. There have been farmers who have actually had a very tough time with, traders who have run away and absconded, and then have actually expressed a lot of distress around what has happened. I think in Karnataka, we have seen protests. I think in Kerala, we've seen a very different kind of response, which is also from the state trying to think about how can it rethink its policies and actually come up with MSP policies. There are states like Odisha which are trying to reimagine what decentralized procurement could be and are looking at millet procurement. So look, I think the larger point here is there's a movement and there's a moment. And this movement is now in Delhi and it's huge here because these are central laws. But I think how they're going to work out regionally, we are going to have to wait and see. And I don't think there is a common story, and I don't think there is silence. There are very active transitions that are happening and contestations that are happening across the states. So I do think we should always remember to, decenter, because it's easy to think of this movement as just particularly located, but the laws affect everybody and they affect the entire country. For the first time, we have central laws on this kind of subject. And I think the ramifications of that will unfold over time in the states.
Yeah. So I think we can all agree that we need to heed by the wise advice of Surinder and give time to this movement also to unfold as it is evolving under our very eyes. Thank you very much, Mekhala, Harish. Thank you very much to my colleagues at TCPD and CPR, and to members of the audience. This was a most engaging conversation. And we look forward to have more conversation on the many topics that have actually emerged through our exchanges. Stay tuned to the CPR-TCPD dialogue in Indian politics. We are going to go back to our favorite distraction, state elections, but we will ensure that we do not lose sight of the larger, more important issues that are at stake at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a great evening, everyone.